Hey everybody, welcome back to VideoMess. So today we're continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and we've got a fun video for you guys this evening. It is the first fundamentally large core update for Nintendo 64 of 2024, and it brings in one of the last features not yet incorporated into the core, which makes a gigantic difference. That is going to be LOD, or level of detail. What this really means, and you might be familiar with it mostly in Super Mario 64, is that there is the ability in hardware to have different detail levels on textures depending on where you are in relationship to them on screen. You'll see here right there when we walked up to Princess Peach, it should transition to Bowser. That is with level of detail unenabled or not included in the core. Now with level of detail, as you walk up to Peach, just like on original hardware, that portrait is going to transition to Bowser. Now this is not what level of detail support was added to the hardware to do. It is just a little bit of visual trickery the developers at Nintendo were playing around with. But you'll see here in the new core you're going to have LOD textures, original is on and off is going to be off, and as you slowly lock up, that level of detail transition is what is now in the core. But outside of that example of Super Mario 64, it's going to be used in a lot more traditional ways throughout the Nintendo 64 library. This is the introductory sequence of Perfect Dark with LOD on. Now the buildings in the background are much pixelated. When we first showed you this game, a lot of people noticed that these buildings basically look like they were completely unfiltered textures. That is because on a level of detail not being enabled in the core and not being included in the code, it didn't have the ability to transfer in different levels of textures depending on what it was looking at. You'll see here, watch this building, it's very smooth, it's not pixelated, and as we switch back over to level of detail off, that building becomes so much more pixelated, and that's because the hardware doesn't have the ability with that toggled off to be able to swap in different textures in real time. That is what level of detail does, and that is what is here in the current core. It's going to change the visual look of so many of the games on the Nintendo 64. Do be aware though that not every single game uses LOD as far as the hardware or game implementation is concerned, so you may see no change whatsoever in certain titles, which I will show you an example of one in just a moment. But moving over to another game, you see Banjo running out of Gruntilda's mouth here over this bridge. This is a very good example, and I was worried that this wouldn't come across as well on YouTube, but this is so obvious. You'll see, once we go to off, that bridge completely changes its look. It is much less detailed. Level of detail can swap in more or less detail depending on how close to the camera an object is, and the developers would set something like that. You'll see here the bridge has a very specific look to it, and when we turn original LOD detail back on, that bridge is going to become much more detailed. Now it is still the Nintendo 64, it's still not going to be a sharp texture, but it's going to be the correct texture. This can happen in the foreground or the background at close areas to the camera or at distances as well. Sometimes it is so subtle you might not even notice if I don't point it out to you, but in other areas it's going to be inherently obvious the minute we toggle that on or off. A big thanks to Andy D for helping with the captures this week as well. He was going through some of these games and sending me notes on them. But this is another big hardware feature that the Nintendo 64 could do, but it wasn't really exclusive to the Nintendo 64. One of the most popular consoles, at least in my opinion, I'm sure you'll disagree in the comments, that had LOD was the 3DO. It utilized it as well for textures at distances. But as we change this from original or on to off, you're going to see the world completely take on a different sort of look. If it's on, that's what the original hardware was going to do, and there's nothing wrong with leaving it off. Look at that bridge right now. We'll turn LOD texture back on, and the bridge, as well as that rope that's suspending it up, does have more detail in the distance. So sometimes it'll increase the level of detail, sometimes it'll actually reduce it down. It just depends on how the developers decided to utilize that hardware feature. But it is built into the hardware, and now as of yesterday it's also built into the Nintendo 64 core, making it one more bit of hardware that has been implemented in FPGA. And watch as we turn it off, everything in the grass just basically becomes a blurrier mess, which is not a problem at all if that's the look you're going for. But if you want original hardware spec, just go ahead and leave it to original. And if you are confused, original in this core always means whatever the hardware would have done out of the box if you had it underneath your TV back in the 90s. Now some games just don't seem to do much with level of detail whatsoever, something like Ocarina of Time here, and these are pre-rendered background images. You're going to see once we switch from original to off, absolutely nothing changes whatsoever. As we go into the actual game world, watch again and see if you can spot any differences. In some games, this LOD toggle is going to be a fundamentally different thing to look at. In some games, it's going to do absolutely nothing or such a minuscule amount of something that you're not going to be able to tell. As far as I can tell, and I've read, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time does not utilize utilize level of detail features, so this one honestly doesn't do anything, and I didn't want you to be aware of that. Let's move over to GoldenEye, because this is another game that utilizes level of detail a ton, and it seems to be the developers at Rare, no surprise, having a real mastery of the hardware, utilize this feature more than seemingly anybody else. But as the camera sweeps back into Pierce Brosnan's brain here, or as you more famously know him, James Bond, you're going to see a big difference in level of detail when we toggle this on or off as well. So do keep your eyes on the textures on the ground, and just so you know, it is in video and audio where this is going to be. Once you go off, everything just becomes blurrier. Once you turn it back on, it's going to get a much more detailed texture loaded in. These are the games where you're going to see a huge difference. Now, as far as the playability of these games are concerned, level of detail has basically no impact on how much fun you're going to have. It's not going to improve performance, it's not going to unimprove performance outside of one cycle which is currently being used to add level of detail in, and trust me, unless you're a machine, you're probably not going to be able to spot that difference. But it is a big visual difference, and that is fun, and it's one more feature of the Nintendo 64 hardware that has been checked off the list and is now incorporated into the core, and that is just awesome. But again, if you turn it off, you're going to see just how much the world changes, going back and forth, back and forth. It is very obvious, even with YouTube compression, and I was very happy to see that, because I thought this was going to be one of those videos where I told you about something that was very hard to actually detect on screen. So it's just another fun thing to have. Again, it just depends what game you're playing. Some games don't utilize this whatsoever, and that toggle is completely useless. Other games like GoldenEye here use it to an absolutely massive degree, but a lot of the fun is going to be turning it on and off and seeing what you can see, because there are games that I didn't feature on this video, like Pilot Wings, that use level of detail as well, and I got to keep these video run times down. I can't give you an hour of just level of detail, so do go out there and experiment. But I've got some other games that use this even more in interesting ways. But again, once you turn it back on, you just see the detail in the world come to life. So definitely leave it on original if you want that original hardware look. Yet if you like a little bit of a blurrier image, honestly, leaving it off is not a bad thing at all ever. It's again a totally subjective option as to whether or not you want to use it. Now, some games will utilize level of detail, but it can be very hard to tell. Now that we move into Majora's Mask, watch the screen here and see if you can see any difference between original and off. In this one clip, I don't notice anything, but leave me a comment down below and tell me if you see something. I will point out a clip later that's going to have a major difference, but honestly, in some games, it's only going to be utilized in sporadic instances, and it might be a blink and you'll miss it sort of situation. And so again, you're going to get different results depending on what game you are playing. Some games utilize level of detail to the maximum, some games don't touch it. But as we go back in here and go from original to off again, I don't really see anything happening on the screen whatsoever, except maybe a little bit of extra detail in that thatched roof. And here, if we go from level of detail off to original, again, I'm not seeing anything whatsoever that is changing, but you can find areas in the game where it actually utilizes this feature, and it's interesting why the developers chose to do it there. I don't have an answer, it's more just very interesting as to where they decided to utilize that hardware resource, because again, in this main area right here, if we go from original to off, nothing changes whatsoever in any of the textures or any of the details. But now if we take a look here, we can actually start getting some things to happen in the next clip. This area right here doesn't have any differences in level of detail, but we have to find a specific set of stairs at a specific distance to the camera to actually be able to see anything, and I will show you that in just a moment. But again, here they are. Look at those stairs right there, look at the detail on them, and you're going to see once we go to off, they're going to change completely. It's almost like a moire pattern goes on top, something you would see in a camera sensor if you tried to shoot something like a screen window. I'm not sure why that this feature is used on those stairs in the distance, but doesn't seem to appear anywhere else. But that's what you're going to find with the level of detail toggle. Sometimes you're going to have to pixel peep to see where it was utilized, and I tried to find a list of games that utilize level of detail in their design, and honestly I didn't find anything online, so if you know of that, leave me a comment down below. I would be curious, because I came up completely empty-handed. But now moving back to another rare game, Banjo Tooie this time, you're going to see a fundamentally huge difference whether or not level of detail is on or off, and this is not at all surprising. If there was a hardware feature that could be used, it seems like the developers at Rare 100% just had to use it every single time, and they did not leave any implementation on the table. They put everything into a game. You go to off, and the ground as well as most of the background just completely changes. This is probably the most fundamentally big difference you're going to see right here. The entire screen loses detail, and when you turn level of detail onto original, it regains that detail in the texturing over what would be the polygons on the ground. So it seems like if you really want to see level of detail in action, you want to go to rare games, although the most famous example of it still is that Peach transitioning to Bowser photo in Mario's castle. But that was a trick. You could use level of detail to actually load in a completely different texture, and that is how Peach and Bowser transition. It is just a little bit of a trickery thing. It's kind of like if I crossfade from one source to the other, I could trick you into thinking something appeared when really I just placed it there. But this is what level of detail does, and it's so great to see it come to the core. There's very few features left in the Nintendo 64 hardware that are not on the MiSTer FPGA core yet, but there definitely still are a few. But there's a lot of different things that still need to be done with the core. There's a lot of different RDP bug fixes coming in soon, hopefully, and I'm sure this core will still be in active development for at least the next 2 to 3 months, if not longer than that. But this is another huge feature, and it's not an easy one to accomplish. The nice thing is it really didn't occupy that much more logic. I believe it was 2 to 3% extra on the logic of the DE10 Nano's FPGA chip than not implementing it whatsoever. So it seems like we're still on the roadmap to have a full hardware implementation of the Nintendo 64 on MiSTer FPGA. And that is just great. And I'm so glad that level of detail came across so vividly in these video samples. I was worried that it might be a little bit hard to articulate what that was. But that's the current situation with the Nintendo 64 core. It is still not an update all, in case you want to ask down below. This is manual install only. You can find it over on the MiSTer FPGA discords. But we have a new feature in the core. It is absolutely spectacular to play around with, and the core progress keeps marching forward. And since this was the big update for 2024, it was fun to get back to talking about Nintendo 64. But I've got some other more unique tests of this core coming soon, so stay tuned for those. And I'm going to be doing a controller guide as well, because you guys asked for it. But if you haven't updated the core in 2024 yet, now is the time to do it. Short of that, thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.